So today we're going to talk about something that should be obvious, but it appears as though people aren't as aware of it as maybe they should be. And yes, we're going to talk about the not going faster than all the other people race, but in the looking different from the other people race. So if you're sensitive to that kind of subject matter, you have been warned. First of all, let's make clear that race isn't really a scientific term. It used to be a pseudoscientific term used to group people together based on phenotypical aspects that were more frequent in some populations than others. And obviously we don't need to spell this out, but most of the time they were just used for the most heinous shit that you could possibly imagine. A term that is more commonly used and does have a scientific meaning today is ethnicity, which isn't so much based on what your ancestry is, but what you identify as. It's a fairly loose term. A lot of different factors can make an ethnicity. And while ethnicities are certainly also a spectrum to a large extent, race, like the mostly just the way you look kind of aspects of a person, a lot more of a spectrum than that even. Let me explain. Look at this. This is what race is. We like to think it's this, but it's really not. There are definitely differences in the way people look depending on what part of the world those people come from. Like, you can't deny that that is the case. But ultimately, black people, white people, Asian people exist in the same way as the colors red, green, and blue exist on the color wheel. This is why people say race is a social construct. The classification is ultimately utterly arbitrary, and this becomes more obvious when you're outside of the Americas. Like, when you go through the color wheel shade by shade, you can't really tell the exact point where red ends and orange begins. And the reason for that is that there isn't such a point. All adjacent colors are very similar to one another. And the same is kind of true of populations across Africa and Eurasia. If you look at neighboring populations, they always look kind of similar to each other. Usually you can't even tell the difference between the phenotypical traits of two neighboring villages. They just look too much the same. But compare one town to the next adjacent town long enough, and eventually this becomes this. And everything in between was a gradient. And this is because, and bear with me here because this is actually true, we're all the same species, we just kind of look different sometimes. You know how every individual looks different to every other individual, and individuals who are related to each other will just have more in common? It's like that, but on a bigger scale. And the reason it's difficult to tell very often is because adjacent people rarely meet our difference threshold. So imagine you have like two tables, right? And on one table there's one handful of sand, and on the other table there's two handfuls of sand. You will be able to tell the difference quite easily because there is 100% more sand on one table than the other. But if you have two mountains of sand, you won't be able to tell which one of them has one handful of sand more, because it doesn't make up a significant proportion of the difference between these two mountains. Now with humans, it's a lot easier to tell apart individuals from each other because there's a lot more factors than just the size of the sand dune. There's a lot of features that can be different, and there's a lot of features that are different between any two given people. Unless we're talking about identical twins. But if you have a crowd of Ethiopians, any individual Ethiopian in that crowd won't stand out as much as they would in a crowd of Irish people, and vice versa. There's just a greater amount of difference between the physical characteristics. Listen, I know this all sounds very, basic, but I'm trying to deconstruct something here. And that really is what allows us to see the phantom of race, even though race isn't really a thing. Because things are a lot more complicated than they are on the color wheel. The geography of the color wheel is just a circle, like a round disc. It's very, very simple. the geography of Earth really is not. Populations separated by big geographical features will be less similar to populations that are technically closer by than those populations are similar to populations that are technically further away, but much easier to find and to trade with and to interact with. And then you have migration, which is often culturally motivated and has always been a thing. I mean, there was literally several centuries at like the end of the Roman Empire to like the early Middle Ages that's known as the migration period. That time frame exists. There was a lot of turmoil going on in the world at that point, a lot of displaced populations, so a lot of people moved around, and they moved around across very long distances. And as technology has advanced, it's become much easier to migrate. So now you take like a bunch of green dots that are the same amount of difference to all the other green dots from where they're from, and you put them in the middle of a bunch of blue dots. So relatively speaking, even though they are objectively the same amount of different to the people that they share an ancestry with as the blue dots, there are relatively a lot more different to the blue dots. And migration as well as intermixing doesn't happen evenly. Racism is a thing, cultural connotations travel across populations, often tied to race by correlation more than causation. The populations of cities that have been big trading hubs for long periods of time will generally be more diverse than any other place. It's just that so many various people from different parts of the world have had traveled through that city at some point. They've gone to the city, they've lived in the city, they left the city. It causes a big melting pot effect. Take, for instance, Istanbul, one of the most important cities in the world historically, literally the bridge between Europe and Asia. A massive trade hub for millennia. All of these people are Turkish people from Istanbul. Notice how diverse they are, because that's what happens when you become a cosmopolitan city of international renown. Of course, there's racism in these places. All this increased diversity also makes it a bit easier to assign labels to people. But then again, like one village where the neighboring village looks basically the same will also find reasons to hate that village simply for being the other village. It is then no surprise to see what makes the Americas different. There's people whose ancestors came there without high-tech means. They came over a land bridge, they spread across the land, just like people did from Africa into Eurasia. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of them left, because at some point Europeans arrived and decided that the land was theirs now. And then they also decided that going to a completely different part of the world to literally just abduct people from their lives and bring them to this third part of the world was also a good idea. Pretty much all of the modern Americas isn't a color wheel. It's just colors from various different parts of the color wheel thrown into the same area. This is how, even though there isn't really such a thing as race, you absolutely can have mixed race people. If we're going to be technical about it, anyone who wasn't born from just straight up brother-sister incest is a mixed race person, simply because there isn't a line between any two races. But it would be dishonest to pretend that that is actually the same thing, because it isn't. Mixed race people are mixed from very different parts of the color wheel. This has always happened, but it's not happened as much and as often and to the extent as it happens in the Americas. We live in a time of unprecedented migration in human history, and we have for a while. Well, I mean, maybe not right this very second because of the whole pandemic situation, but you know what I mean. As globalization has increased, so has migration. It's very easy to just move halfway across the world right now. And people do it all the time, as individuals and as groups. There being a huge amount of diversity in every city, and some degree of diversity even in the most rural areas, is a very recent development, historically speaking. And while the differences have never been this pronounced on a visual level, maybe we should take the time to realize that race is a shite way to group people. No useful information about any individual ever in the entire history of mankind has ever been gained by looking at their race. Literally, the clothes you are wearing say so much more about you than the color of your skin or the shape of your eyes. And that's simply because you choose the clothes that you wear, and you don't choose your racial characteristics. We live in a strange world where the illusion of race exists because we can't see the gradient of race. We've never really been able to see it because it's difficult to get a bird's eye view in the best of cases, but right now, where we have the option to do that, we very often just don't. But race is fiction. Race is a social construct. That doesn't mean it's not real. Social constructs can have massive impacts on people's lives and the opportunities that they have and the way they are judged by others. It shouldn't be a real thing. Race shouldn't be a social construct that exists and that we abide by. It is absurd that something that says this little about a person defines so much of how others see them. And this is what people generally mean when they say, I am colorblind. Like, of course I can see you are from a different race. But like, so what? That's not useful information. That is just baseline physical characteristics. It says nothing about who you actually are. At worst, judging people by their race will just make you hate them. And we could all do with maybe a little less hate in the world. So why not just disregard that shit and meet people as what they actually are? Individuals with their own life experiences, opinions, thoughts, wishes, and stories. Yes, they may overlap with other people. Absolutely, they may overlap more with people who share similar racial traits because of the way that society is built. But at the end of the day, we all grow up on the same planet. Gravity is always down. There's gonna be some overlap between all of us. It's a great chance for some empathy. So next time you see someone making any kind of judgments about a person solely because of what they look like, maybe explain to them why that's kind of dumb. What a hard-hitting, controversial political message. Racism bad. Racism is dumbhead person thing. No, it's like I have to talk about it. I just wanted to deconstruct race as a thing, but it would feel dishonest not to talk about the fact that even though race isn't a thing, racism very much is. So thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. Share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. Maybe buying some of my merch. I still haven't checked if they still ship the merchandise. I know they don't ship the short story collection right now. You can only get the ebook. And in that spirit, don't be racist. I don't know why, no, definitely some people need to be told this. But like, why? And see you around, cunts.